here. Mike, I'm an alcoholic. I decided a while ago I was going to talk about all the traditions, because I need to do that anyway, and I need to record it. But because I didn't think there was going to be anybody here for real, so that's what I've been doing, is sort of looking them over and remembering all the stories behind them. But I'd like to start off with a little joke I heard one time. This guy was doing his first solo parachute jump, and not the tandem business. I'm talking about the one where he's by himself. And so he gets pushed out of the plane, and his training kicks in. He knows what he's supposed to do. So he pulls the ripcord, and nothing happens. Well, he's got problems. He's got real problems. But his training kicks in, like I said, as any good person that trains to do something, they always tell you do all this stuff over and over, so when the time comes, your training kicks in. So he pulled the reserve chute, and nothing happened. So he's got real problems now. So suspend disbelief just for a minute. He passes somebody going the other way, that's going just as fast the other way, and they are able to have a small conversation. That's why you have to suspend disbelief, because they're able to speak a few words as they pass. And they pass, and the guy that just jumped out of the airplane says, "Hey man, do you know anything about parachutes?" And the guy going the other way says, "Hey man, do you know anything about light and gas stoves?" What does that have to do with what we're going to talk about? I don't know anything about parachutes or gas stoves, but what I do, what I'm here to talk about, I do know a little bit about. Basically, it's the program of action and the traditions here. And I decided to talk about some traditions just a little while ago, and try the best of my ability in such short notice to put together something that may dovetail with the steps. I never know how it's going to turn out, but usually my mind helps me out and makes it make sense. But what I want to do is talk about your traditions. I don't have a book in front of me, so I just have to rely on my prior study of them. But there's a story behind each one of these, and the skeleton of them you can see in the big book. Actually, in one of the forwards, it talks about some things that sound a lot like these. But it wasn't until the second edition came out, roughly about 1953, after the book had been around for about 18 years, that they published the actual 12 and 12. Of course, Bill W. wrote the whole thing. Bill W. wrote the first 164 pages, except for the chapter called Employers, and there a man named Hank P. was given an honorable mention. One of the card-carrying atheists, along with Whiskey and Milkman Jim, he was given an honorable mention because he played such an integral part in helping them formulate Works Publishing, which they used to publish the book. He was the Standard Oil executive but he was one of the card-carrying atheists of the day, and him and Jim are why we have As We Understood Him in the steps. But that's another story for another day. But Hank P. was able to come around to our way, was not able to come around to our way of living, and he died drunk, and they bought his shares of Work Publishing for like $25 and a sandwich at a delicatessen. At least that's what AA Comes of Age says. But Jim, Whiskey and Milkman, from 35 and 36, was able to enlarge his spiritual life eventually and come around to our way of thinking, and was able to stay sober for the rest of his life. But back to traditions, Bill W. wrote the 12 and 12, where he goes into each one of the traditions in the back part of the book. Of course, the front part of the book is going to be the steps part. The way I look at the 12 and 12 is I look at it in the steps part, not the traditions part, but in the steps part I look at to enhance, not to replace the first 164 pages. Very important that be said. to enhance, not to replace, which means I will use it to enhance a point that I'm making using the big book, but I don't replace it. And I don't recommend trying to work the steps out of it. But it's some good, very good material that can be used to enhance the big book. But as far as the 12 and 12, the tradition section, it stands alone in splendid isolation. But to truly learn more about the underpinnings behind the traditions, one needs to go get AA Comes of Age, which has 3 sections actually. One's called Recovery, which I call Bill's Story Plus, which is Bill's story, his entire life story, all the stuff underneath the surface, between the lines in Bill's story and everything else, all kinds of cool stuff. A lot of different players start coming out. Also, the next section is called Unity, where it goes into an in-depth discussion of each one of the 12 traditions, and I highly recommend that because it sheds a little extra light, which is important. To me, not to everybody. I mean, who actually goes and reads these books, right? But there are some people that really consider it to be important, and I'm one of those. So the last section, and it sort of leads me into the discussion of the 12 traditions, because the last section is called Service. But basically, it goes into what something that came along later called the 12 Concepts. I mean, it's basically for lack of a better word, the politics of AA, right? The politics of AA and the 12 concepts of how to run a huge world-level business meeting with delegates from all over the world, and parliamentary procedure, and you have the floor, and do I hear a motion, and all of that stuff. And it's like, I didn't even bother to read it. I'm not even interested, because I call that the bleeding deacon section, because, I believe, it's just my opinion, and somehow I believe the statistics of the success rate bear it out, that AA worked better before there was a bunch of politics. AA works better before there was a bunch of politics and people wearing different hats and saying, I'm a delegate, you need to listen to me. I've actually heard a guy at a Tampa Roundup in '99 was having a rather heated discussion with somebody about something. I mean, it was a long time ago. It wasn't important. But what was important was what I heard him say, and it burned in my mind. You need to listen to me because I'm a delegate. And that burned in my mind, and I was thinking, I didn't know as much as I know now then, and I thought he was an idiot, so I wasn't going to listen to him regardless of whether he had delegate on his hand or the president of AA. But the thing about it was he was trapped into the office and the identity of himself being that. I wonder what would have happened to him if he took the hat off. Would he still be somebody in his own mind? And I believe that the steps, without all of those accoutrements, for lack of a better word, the steps help me to feel like I'm somebody without having to have a title. I can just be a regular AA member. And we're going to talk more about this idea about clamoring for election to office when we talk about the tradition 2. But let's talk about tradition 1. Now, you may be asking, you can see I'm getting a little more comfortable because I didn't know how this was going to go, but I can start to see how it's going to flow together. How was I going to dovetail the beginning of the talk with starting to talk about this? You may be asking yourself, why is he talking about the tradition? I mean, I'd rather hear a bunch of war stories. That may be what you're thinking. Maybe subconsciously you won't realize it, but it may be what you're thinking subconsciously because you're so used to people doing that, right? I mean, you go to a speaker meeting, what are you going to hear? You're going to hear 55 minutes of somebody talking about getting drunk and high. That's what you're going to hear, period. That's what you're going to hear. I've been to thousands of them. I know what I'm talking about. I've been playing this game for a long time. And then it's 5 till, oh, wait a minute. It's 5 till, I'm in recovery and we'll holler. That's what you get. Well, I figured, hey, for a long time now, even when I tell my story, I don't play that game. I tell 0 war stories because they have 0 value to me. And I don't think to anybody else. But what can I tell, what can I talk about that's not war stories, that's valuable information that maybe a lot of folks maybe they're the busy lives. They don't get a chance to be some egghead like me that read AA Comes of Age and Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers and took notes in a 3-ring binder and took notes on it as I read it, and somebody who spent the time to actually learn the big book literally back and forwards where I could tell you what's on every page and shit like that. Nobody really does that, right? But there are a lot of people that are busy and can't do that, but they find it interesting how this thing came about. Who were the players? And what do some things mean, especially these traditions? I mean, I know for me it wasn't for years and years until I even considered knowing them, just saying them off the wall without looking at them, let alone knowing the story behind each one of them, which has tremendous value, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And what I'm going to talk about is in context of the traditions are a decision for individual members to follow them, right? The tradition is not, they stand alone for each member to decide whether or not they follow them. And when more people follow them than not, it becomes the group following them. You follow what I'm saying? And that's going to come back when I start talking about something in a minute. That's why I needed to interject that thought, that the traditions, people, individuals in the group choose to follow them. So which means what I'm saying is that these traditions are applicable to individuals as much as it is to the group as a whole. And when I start talking about 8, you'll see what I'm talking about. All right, let's talk about the first one. Our common welfare comes first. Personal recovery depends on AA unity. When we think about unity, a lot of people think about unity means we're supposed to all get along. We're supposed to all get along and nobody has any disagreements. That's unity. And anybody that tries to say anything that people don't agree with, they're causing trouble. They're rabble-rousers, right? Rabble-rousers like, let's see, who was rabble-rousers in history that it turned out they happened to be right? Let's see, Columbus was a rabble-rouser, right? What did he say? Columbus said, hey folks, I hate to break it to you, but I think that the world is round. And they said, no bro, it's flat. The water just runs off the edge. And, they locked his ass up. What about this next guy was a show-enough rouser. He's mentioned in the big book too. Galileo was a show-enough rabble-rouser. You know what he said, right? I mean, he said something crazy. He said this astronomical heresy that the earth revolved around the sun. Everybody thought that the sun revolved around, the best minds in the world thought that the sun revolved around the earth, and he said, I hate to break it to you, I've been doing a little studying on this. They literally locked him up. He died in house arrest. Okay, so he was a rabble-rouser, but the thing about it is that it seems to me that some of the most important things that humankind have learned has been from somebody that's willing to say what they believe regardless of what other people think about it. So independent thinkers are not very frequent, but absolutely important, lest we all walk in lockstep and all be in agreement and be our mindless drones and do what we're told and be just followers. So I believe that studying this stuff makes someone a well-rounded AA member because at least they can understand what's going on and see what it means for them and know whether or not they choose to follow a certain set of people. Because what it ends up looking like is, in recovery, you learn what you stand for. Because if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. I can't just take what people say and say, yeah, that's what I stand for. Yeah, that's what I stand for. Sometimes it takes blood, sweat, and tears. Sometimes it takes mistakes. Sometimes, as time goes on, I have to see something like, if I see somebody clubbing a baby seal, it's going to disturb me. What the fuck does that have to do with anything, Mike? Well, it has everything to do with it because we say, well, anytime something disturbs me, there's something wrong with me, right? At least that's what the book says. But if I see somebody clubbing a baby seal, I'm going to be disturbed. The real question is there something wrong with me because I'm disturbed about somebody clubbing a baby seal, or am I wanting to go over there and take that stick away from them and start clubbing them? So sometimes things that disturb us allow me to see where I stand on different things. See, so in that light, it can be a good thing that something could disturb me. like somebody beating a kid or a woman, that elevator thing where that dude cold cocked that chick. I was like, that's not cool. Of course, that's the way I was brought up, but I just saw it and instantly had an idea in my mind that that's not cool. We don't do that as men. It's just me. Some other people may think that's cool as shit, and there are a lot of women that think that's cool as shit because they stay with them. But the thing about it is, I mean, whatever, actions speak louder than words. So anyway, so what are we talking about? It doesn't mean that we all get along when we say unity. What does unity mean? It means unity of purpose. It means we agree that we're here for the same reason. Unity of purpose means that we agree that we're here to talk about the 12 steps out of the book as the way to stop drinking and using drugs. That's the unity we're talking about. We're not talking about everybody's supposed to get along. Believe me, that ain't going to happen. You can't even get a group of 5 people, alcoholics, after a meeting to figure out where they're going to go eat. I mean, you can't get agreement about hardly anything, But the thing about it is what it's talking about is unity of purpose. And what is that purpose, and why am I using that word? Because the word purpose seems to be used over and over. Where is it used? It talks about 5 talks about a primary purpose. 6 talks about lest we get diverted from our primary purpose. Okay, so this idea about purpose comes in over and over and over for our group purpose. See, so there's continuity in these things, and the more we study them, the more we find that this idea about agreeing on what we're here for is present throughout these, even though these have their individual nuances. You'll start, as I continue to talk, see how they have tremendous connection, and they flow, because one will be after the other, and the one before it will explain why the next one says what it says. And that'll be more clear in 4 or 5 when I start talking about that. So the story behind AA Unity comes from AA Comes of Age, the more valuable story. He's talking about when the people hit the cold water and the shipwreck. And let's talk about why there's so many references of shipwrecks. Remember in the book he talks about the foundering vessel I had become, clinging to it like a life preserver of a drowning man. The ship references, when this chip of a book is launched on the world tide of alcoholism, defeated drinkers will seize upon its suggestions. All these references of sinking ships. What is all this business? Is this guy some kind of a yachtsman? No, it's because when he wrote the book, Titanic had just happened. And any time you heard anything about a ship or a drowning somebody, because everybody knew somebody that died. So whenever you heard these references, your mind automatically got serious. Let me listen, because this is serious, because I remember how I felt that day. Remember that day, September 11, 2001? That day. We have a that day. They had that day. And the generation in between had the day that Kennedy was shot. That was that day. That was my parents' day. Right? They knew where they were that day, where they were standing, what they felt, what they saw. See, if we wrote a book today, it would be about falling buildings, because everybody go, oh, wait a minute, let me take a look at this. Let me listen to what they're trying to say. That's why we keep talking about the ocean. So in the story about one, I need to start moving, because you can see how time can just get away from you. A seminar like this could last easy 2 or 3 hours. If you were to actually study about it, have the book in front of you, have all the references out of the 12 and 12 and all these books, which I don't have. I'm having to rely on rote memorization from the past, because I just decided to do this on the fly. So it's going to be painfully deficient to me, but probably pretty interesting to somebody that's never even heard about the underpinnings of all these. So he's talking about the story of unity in one. Is he's talking about, he describes they all are in the water and they're floating. And they're fearing that the sharks are under there, and there's no dinghies, there's no boats, and they're all floating. And he said, there's safety in numbers, but each person has to tread their own water. That was what he described. And all of a sudden I started thinking, that's where I started thinking of the concept of each person decides to follow these. And when a group of many people decide to follow them, then you have the group deciding to follow them. But it starts with one person. Because if you're all floating in the water, I can't drag and hold on to you and you keep me up too. Every person has to tread his own water, and then we're all up here carrying the same message. We have unity of purpose to not drown. All right, let's talk about 2, because we need to move on a little bit. 2 is very interesting. The story behind 2 is where Bill was given an opportunity to work at Towns Hospital by Dr. Silkworth, and he needed a job because his wife still worked at the clothing store, and she didn't make much money, and none of them did. He was spending all his time working with people, so he really needed a job. And Silkworth said, "We'll give you an office. You can come work at the treatment it wasn't a treatment center. Don't get me started, because I will get started a little later on that, just a tad. But it was a hospital where they detoxed somebody for a few days. But he was going to have an office there. He was going to get paid because they brought these alcoholics in there, and they started not locking them up in an insane asylum. They started realizing that they could detox them, and maybe Bill could help them talking about the steps. But what's the story? The story is he went back to his group, and they all voted and agreed that he shouldn't take the job, even though he needed the job. So he didn't take it because the group conscience spoke. And he needed personally that money because he needed to feel like a man, right? And that ties into 7, being self-supporting. But he didn't take it because the group conscience spoke. Let's go a little deeper in 2. A little deeper in 2 is going to be 135. I don't know the pages in the 12 and 12 as good as I know the big book, but there are some pages that I know, and this one is one of them. 135 talks about the difference between a bleeding deacon and an elder statesman. And that goes into the guy that was at Tampa, right? You need to listen to me because I'm a delegate. Clearly a bleeding deacon. And when you hear the definition, you'll know that I'm right. On 135, it talks about a bleeding deacon and an elder statesman. A bleeding deacon is somebody who's always clamoring for election to office. It's somebody who can't let go of what he thinks is control over the group. He thinks the group cannot get along without him. These are the quotes right off of 135. All right? He's robbed of his AA spirit. What the book says on 135, it says, it seems the AA landscape is littered with bleeding forms. And by this time, even Bill started seeing that this politics of AA was starting to cause problems with people and the ripple effects of that. And then it goes on to see, he says, happily, some have emerged through that process and emerged to become elder statesmen. So what that means is that every person, in my opinion, and I have done this, needs to get involved in service work. I need to be the secretary, I need to be the treasurer, I need to get involved. I'm not talking about I've never wanted to be a delegate or any of that stuff. I've always had a visceral reaction to all that politics stuff. But because the real work is done in a group. Not in California where 10,000 people are arguing over whether it's a Coke machine or a Pepsi machine and nothing gets decided because they table it to next year. I'm talking about, the real work is done in the group setting. So I found myself doing the secretary and the treasurer and being a part of the group, and it was specifically my home group at the time, and I did get the feeling that the group wouldn't go on without me. And I began to get an overdeveloped feeling of my own importance. And I wanted to hang on to that power because I thought it was power, but it really wasn't. And then I failed to realize that the spirit of rotation is about old-timers who have done something, turning it over to new people so they could once get the feeling of belonging and assistance of helping this thing go off that I once got. But then I was losing it, right? So it's just like alcohol. It used to work for me, and then it started working on me. So the high of the power of service work started working on me. So my sponsor told me, he goes, don't you think it's time for you to turn this over to somebody new so they can get the feeling that you once got? And that's when I turned over the service work, and I haven't done it since. Except the HUD called me in one time when somebody stole all the money, and they asked me to get some checks and balances, and I built a safe, and all these logs and things. But then when that was done, I backed off. But I was asked to help. But I don't solicit trying to get involved in running the thing anymore because I know newcomers need an opportunity to do it. So we talk about the difference between bleeding deacons and elder statesmen. So clearly that delegate couldn't let go, could he? I needed to hand him a tissue because he was bleeding all over the floor. We know what it is now because we know what the definition is, and you can go check it out on 135. So happily now I'm an elder statesman because I'm not trying to run the show. And by definition, I'm an elder statesman because I've been through that feeling of the power of having to have an office and thinking AA couldn't get along without me. But I emerged sober and decided that I'm going to let somebody else do that. And now I'm just an AA member. I don't try to run it anymore. I don't want to run it. So That's 2. The group conscience is spoken. Let's go to 3. Let's go to the real reason behind 3 and what brought about 3. I really wish that time hadn't gotten away from me, but we haven't talked any war stories, right? And we're just talking about valuable information, and I'm up here conveying what I've learned through my travels in my tenure here. All right, 3 came about because when Bill and Bob were going to the Oxford group early on, and we found that the Oxford group was held money in high regard. And when alcoholics who didn't look the way they wanted them to look started coming into meetings and stinking up the place, the Oxford group started telling Bill and Bob, hey, we don't want them here. So in 1938, even before the book was written, Bill and Bob said, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And they broke off from the Oxford group, and they went and got their own place. So the people didn't look, that didn't look like the Oxford group didn't want them there, so anybody could come. So what we find is that it says, the only requirement for AA membership is the desire to stop drinking. Anybody can be a member, but to be a fellow, I need to work the steps. That is an important difference, and it's delineated in the book too. Anybody can be a member to warm a seat, but to be a fellow, I need to work the steps. Because an actual Alcoholics Anonymous is a person who has worked the steps out of the book. You say, Mike, you don't know what you're talking about. The fellowship took its name from the book later. So in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it talks about it in the book, life among Alcoholics Anonymous is more than attending gatherings, is one of the quotes. Future fellows of Alcoholics Anonymous. An Alcoholics Anonymous is a person who has worked the steps. It's not a fellowship. The fellowship took the name later. So you have the program and you have the fellowship. They're 2 different things, and a lot of people try to stay sober off the fellowship and don't use the book, and that's why 5 and 100 make it instead of 75 and 100 make it when they wrote the book, because the Forward to the Second Tradition has those statistics in there. All right, let's talk about 4. It's an interesting story. I'm going to speed it up a little bit. You can push rewind if you missed something. That's supposed to be funny, but I will put this up on my YouTube. I do know that. All right. So each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups as a whole. The story behind this was there was a building in some state. I don't know where it was, but they had a 3-story building, and they had it was a big AA group, and somebody who had some money built this house, and they had like all these members, and it was like a big deal. And they were going to have relationship advising on one floor and financial advising on the next floor, and they were going to do those lowly AA meetings on the bottom floor, right? They were getting into all kinds of stuff. They had 61 rules. And they wrote to Bill and Bob, and they said, we're so excited with themselves. We've got this building, and we're going to do all this stuff. You know, they thought Bill and Bob were going to go, that's great. But Bill and Bob said, we think you need to be careful, because it sounds like to me you're getting into some stuff that's not our purpose. So what you have is, of course, all those people got drunk. All those people got drunk. And later on, they wrote Bill and Bob on a napkin. They opened it up, and it said, Rule 62, don't take yourself too damn seriously. So Bill and Bob allowed these people to have their own group that did all this stuff that wasn't about what AA, because Bill and Bob were trying to let go of control. They let them do what they wanted to do. They figured out that the inevitable was going to happen. It did happen. And these people realized that although a group can be autonomous, we need to stick to our purpose. So that's the story behind 4. The catchphrase is, the group has the right to be wrong. The 5th tradition, we start seeing the word purpose show up, 5 and 6. 5 is talking, and there's an interesting word in 5 that a lot of people miss. It's called its. Its is a big word in this tradition. It says primary purpose to carry its message. Why doesn't it say this message? Because in our big book it talks about carry this message. It talks in another place, this message. Well, why does it say its message? Well, it says its message. Remember what I told you about? We begin to see how one sets the stage and the next one builds on it. 5 builds on 4 because its message has to do with this meeting being autonomous. Meaning that you can go to a meeting and it don't have to have this message, the big book. It can have its message. And I'll give you an example. I can take you to a meeting right now where they'll be talking about so much drama, and let me tell on my disease, and I'm wanting to use, you would want to use more than when you leave than when you got there. And if they didn't read AA at the beginning of the meeting, you wouldn't know what kind of meeting you was in. See, that's its message, but that's not this message. So what is the lesson behind 5? The lesson behind 5 is I need to go to meetings where its message is this message. Because if I don't, I ain't getting fed. And most people never know the difference. They go to meetings because that's the only meeting that they go to, and they don't realize there's anything better. And they sit there, and everybody one-ups each other on the drama stories, and ain't a single person talked about the steps or living out of the ditch or working the steps or anything. I've been to these meetings. I could show you where they are. I know where they are. So the thing about it is that it is the key word. So now when you look at 5, you'll never see it the same way again, because it is the operative word in that. It needs to be this, or I need to go to a different meeting. Let's talk about 6. It's a very interesting step. It has a very interesting story behind it. Okay? AA lending never endorsed, finance, or lend the AA name to any related enterprise, facility or outside enterprise. Less problems of property, prestige, divert us from our primary purpose. Okay? Well, obviously we're talking about money. And what's the story behind this? The story behind this was where a liquor company asked AA to endorse them. They wanted AA to be on the advertisement. AA says this is good liquor. I mean, that sounds stupid as shit on its face, doesn't it? AA says this is good liquor. What the hell is that? But this is a true story. This is why we have 6, because this liquor company, and believe me, they needed some money. They happened to need some money at the time. So what they learned was, this is not a good idea. What they were thinking about doing, they were going to endorse, lend the AA name to something else, because in doing so, they were being diverted from their primary purpose. So they decided not to endorse the liquor company, which was a good decision, but that's the story behind 6. So now we begin to see, just like the story with the steps and all the players behind it, you begin to see that these things are brought about by actual instances of people doing different things, sometimes making mistakes. So this wasn't just, he just sat in his bed in a vacuum, in splendid isolation, and just wrote these 12 things. No, there's stories behind all of these. And sometimes they connect together. And the inner workings, is important to know the inner workings and how they dovetail together, like 4 and 5. Okay, let's talk about 7. I think 7 is pretty clear, but 7 has the story about Rockefeller was going to give us $5 grand. Maybe some of you have heard that. Rockefeller was going to give us $5 grand because they needed some money. They needed some money to try to get the book off the ground. And they were belaboring whether to take the money. And then this guy named Gene Exman, who basically was some kind of publisher dude, and from what I understand, he printed the books for them first for free and let them pay him later. Okay, so basically 7 is we realize we need to try to be self-supporting. And why? Because if we let somebody else finance us, what happens then? They can tell us what they want us to say. If we let somebody pay the deal, then they have a say in what we say. But if we support ourselves, then we can stay true to this message, which is we can stay true to the unity of purpose if we don't have somebody else interjecting their money who may have different motives. Who knows what they have? All right, let's talk about 8. This is very interesting, and it's very poignant, because what I talked about was in the beginning that traditions or individuals choose to follow them. 8 has come to pass in the last at least 15 years as something that is it just came to me one day. And I'm not asking you to agree with it, what I'm about to say. But it is what it is. Okay, what does 8 say? Should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. Okay, what is the special worker? Okay, well, they had an AA clubhouse up there in New York. And they were telling this guy, hey, it's service work for you to sweep the floor every day. We want you to come in before hours and sweep the floor and take out the garbage. Does that sound like 12-step work to you? That guy started going, hey, man, this ain't right. You're asking me to do work around here, and you ain't paying me. That's the special worker that they're talking about. They decided that, if we've got somebody that's doing something for us that's not exactly AA related, maybe we should pay them. He's a special worker. That is not 12-step work, asking somebody to take out the garbage and cut the grass and all that stuff. That's the special worker that they're talking about. And there are places that ask people to do all kinds of things under the guise of service work. But that's not exactly what it is. But what is the eighth thing that I was going to talk about? What's the word professional mean? The word professional means, it doesn't mean somebody does it the best. It doesn't mean that you're Tiger Woods and you play golf better than anybody on the planet. It doesn't mean the professional means that you're better than skiing than anybody, you're Lindsey Vonn. A professional simply means, by definition, that somebody gets paid for it. That's all. That is the only thing that the word professional means. It means you got paid for it. You could do it shitty, but if you got paid for it, you're a professional. It's simple. It's simple definitional language. Okay? So where am I going with this? A professional is somebody that gets paid. On 19 in our book, it talks about no one makes a vocation of this work. He's talking about a job. What's happened in the last 15 years is you've got a Pat's Prentice on every corner. I was an addict for 10 years and now I'm not. You've got a treatment center selling recovery of every manner and means possibly imagine. You've got members in AA, full of AA. I don't know anybody that's not breaking 8 every day. Because if I go to work and I do talk about the steps in any way, shape, or form, if I share my experience with the steps, how to work the steps, or anything else, and I cash a paycheck, I am a professional and I've broken 8. Now, are we going to change anything? Hell no. Ain't nobody fixing to quit or change shit. But what I'm telling you is 8 has outgrown its usefulness because it has been broken like cordwood. It's snapping like a fucking Slim Jim every day. Because it has become a business. Recovery has become a business. And it's tragic. Maybe I should just stop right there. Because I could go on a little farther. But I won't. I'll just say what I needed to say that's based in fact to give you a chance to think about the word professional. What is it? Who is the special worker? And what is and isn't service work? That's why I've never considered making it a vocation. I've become a lawyer and a CPA in recovery. I never considered hanging out in the woods up there, if you know what I'm talking about. Let's talk about 9. This is very interesting. We ought to never be organized, but we have to create service boards or committees. How many times y'all been to a business meeting and they say, well, we got a fundraiser coming up. We're going to let Susie, Bobby, and Sally get together, and they're going to be the little subcommittee. They're going to work it all out, and they're going to come back to the business meeting and tell us about it. That's basically 9. I don't have a lot to say about 9. It's probably a good thing. Look at that clock right there. It's unbelievable. Time flies, I'm telling you. Once you get going with this, time flies. I feel constrained by time and bridled by what I actually want to say. But, it is what it is. But like I said in the beginning, I didn't know how it was going to turn out. Let's talk about 10. 10 is very interesting. There's a story behind it, too. What does it say? Alcoholics Anonymous, no opinion on outside issues. AA name ought to never be drawn into public controversy. What was the public controversy? Prohibition. They came to AA. They said, we AA, we want you to have an opinion on this prohibition business. That was the outside issue. They wanted AA to say something about it. What they wanted to say? We think y'all ought to keep prohibition there. Yeah, we the ills of alcoholism, being like the Washingtonians. They were just talking about how they hated alcohol, but they didn't have no steps to back it up, and they all got drunk. But we're not going to stand on the street corner, so to speak, and say, yeah, we're going to vote for prohibition. That was when they outlawed alcohol. That they eventually overturned. But that was the story behind 10, was that they wanted AA to have an opinion on prohibition. You can go look all this up. You can go verify all of this I'm talking about. You can go into 12 and 12, and you can go in AA Comes of Age. Every single word I've been talking about is verifiable because I just happen to have taken the time to go and study this stuff. All right? So, as a group and as individuals within the group, which leads us into 11 and 12, we need to be careful about having an opinion and pinning AA on our jacket while we're doing it. Why is it so dangerous? 11 tells us why it's dangerous. And there's another interesting word. Remember how at 5 it was it? In 11, the operative word is at the level. Dr. Bob told an entire story in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers about at the level. What is at the level? He went in depth about it. At the level. Let's see what it says. Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. How many times have you heard somebody say, it's a program of attraction rather than promotion? That is not written anywhere. That's what it says, our public relations policy. It is not a program of attraction rather than promotion. Moreover, in every meeting I've gone to where they talk about the solution, we are promoting it to newcomers as a way of life that we highly encourage. A public relations policy is based on attraction. That means talking to people who have no idea what we're talking about. So that's why knowing what's going on with a lot of these, knowing the underpinning, knowing the real meaning, because you'll hear things that aren't exactly based in fact. It is a program of attraction rather than promotion. That is not written anywhere. And that is a misnomer and a misspeaking of what 11 is trying to say to us. Why is it trying to say it? It means if I go out there and somebody is on the news and they come to me and say, hey, I heard you're an AA member. Yeah, I'm an AA member, man. Oh, it's happening. Oh, it's the place to be. They got hot chicks and it's all good. You need to bust up in there and check it out. And then the next week, I'm drunk. I've made myself an AA spokesperson, used their name, and then the next week they see me on the corner and I'm going, yeah, one of them good-looking chicks got me drunk. Okay? That's what 11 is saying, be careful. Don't go out there speaking on behalf of AA, because the next thing you know, your ass will be drunk. So we don't do that. Because AA can't speak. It's like a corporate entity is supposed to be considered a person, but it has to have an individual person actually speak for it. Who is it? The CFO, the CEO. A person has to speak for the entity. It always can be that way because AA ain't never sprouted lips except through an individual that speaks on its behalf. And what 11 is talking about is don't go out there speaking on behalf, because if your ass shows up drunk, you're going to make us all look bad, bro, so don't do that. That's the Ebonics version. Okay, check this out. What is this at the level business? All right, how did people used to introduce themselves in AA? Now today we say, I'm Mike Addict, I'm Mike Alcoholic. At the level has everything to do with how we used to introduce ourselves. And how if we're not careful and we don't study the AA history, we will start doing things the opposite of the way they were originally intended. And then we wonder how we got here. This is one of those perfect examples. What is at the level? He talks about there is above the level and there's below the level. It's dangerous to be anonymous. Excuse me. It's dangerous to be too anonymous below the level. It's absolutely necessary to be anonymous above the level. What is at the level, okay? We already talked about above the level and why it's necessary to be anonymous. So if I'm not drunk next week, it don't reflect badly on AA. We know about that. But what is below the level? He said we must not be too anonymous to those individuals in the meeting, because it can be dangerous if we're anonymous below the level, meaning this. We should introduce ourselves the exact way we're listed in the phone book. Full name, so somebody could go home and look us up in the phone book. So I'm supposed to say, I'm Michael Wayne Smith, and I'm an alcoholic, because of the danger of being too anonymous below the level. This is before the days of you could go to Vistaprint and get 250 business cards for $6.95 free shipping. They didn't know how to get in touch with you. But if you said your name, they could go look you up and call you after. That's how everybody used to introduce themselves with their full name when they wrote the book. You didn't know that, did you? That's cool stuff. But that is at the level. So what has happened over time? We've become totally anonymous below the level. And nobody knows how to get in touch with somebody unless they go up to them and ask them their phone number after the meeting. It's a subtle nuance, but it's absolutely important. You can see how us moving away from the way it was originally intended has made us do things differently than the way it was. And if you add up enough of those differences, it can change the face of AA. It can change the face of its effectiveness, and it has. I could go into several differences, major differences, but I don't have time to do that. All right, we've talked about at the level. So remember, 5 is it, and 11 is at the level. An interesting discussion. I highly recommend you consider it, think about it, go verify it, but I'm not fixing to go say I'm Michael Wayne Smith and I'm an alcoholic. I like it the way it sounds. I'm saying I'm Michael Alcoholic. I just like it. Plus, I got business cards and I can give out my number. So I'm not advocating everybody go do their full name. I'm simply providing the information. So if somebody you ever hear in a meeting that says their first and last name, those people that we snicker at, you go, what do you think? You think you're special, bro? Actually, they're doing it the way it's supposed to be done. Because I've heard them, and I used to snicker at them. Now I go, okay, it's understanding. All right, what is 12? 12 is, how big of a deal was it to say you were an alcoholic when they wrote the book? It was huge. You were putting the scarlet letter on your head. If you told somebody that, you could forget getting a job. Even today, there's a little bit of misunderstanding. But back then, it was like, man, you were making a big mistake. And if you broke somebody else's anonymity and said, hey, I saw my boy down at the meeting, fired on the spot, blackballed, probably prosecuted, depending on what kind of, if you handled money, who knows what they would have done. So, 12, and I hate to say this because this is true, some of these changes that I talked about before have gotten away from the way it was originally intended and have hurt AA. 12 has sort of lost its effectiveness because it's become rather accepted to say you're an addict. I mean, there's Grace Slick, there's Anthony Hopkins, I mean, there's people in AA, they're openly saying it. It's not as much of a bad scarlet letter as it used to be. I mean, it's still tough to say this shit and concede to my innermost self that I'm an alcoholic. Let's not get it wrong. We know it is. But as far as the idea of saying I'm an addict or an alcoholic, it's not as bad as it used to be because treatment centers are so prevalent. There's shows of numerous ones that talk about 12-step people and alcoholics and going to meetings in the shows. You've seen these shows. Everybody's talking about it. You go to any church, I don't care. As long as it's not the same one that they made me go to when I was a child where they're singing Bringing in the Sheaves and you can't move or talk and the God of my childhood is still circling the First Baptist Church striking down sinners. I'm talking about one of these fun churches where they have drums and guitars and stuff. You listen to those preachers. They're all 12-step topics. They're all talking about it because they've realized it's cool stuff. They've also realized it came right out of the Bible, which is true, and that's a whole discussion for another day. We could talk an hour on that by itself. Let's talk about, well, I don't know why I'm moving that. You probably can't read it anyway. There's an interesting story about 12. What do we say at the end of a meeting? Here's another difference that you could sink your teeth into. How many times have you been to a meeting and somebody says, what you heard here, who you saw here, leave it here when you leave here. What do they say? What you heard here, who you saw here, please leave it here. Keep it here when you leave here. Let it stay here when you leave here. Okay. That means, this is interesting when you think about it. Try this hat on. You're supposed to go to a meeting. You're not supposed to tell who you saw. Okay, I get it. But that means you're not supposed to use anything you heard and go and put it in your life. Leave what you heard here. You don't take it. Wait a minute. That don't make sense on its face, does it? Seems like we're supposed to take cool things we hear and go apply them in our lives. Now, that being said, that sets the stage for the way they used to end the meetings. Okay, now I have a recording of a talk when Bill spoke the night Dr. Bob died in 1951. It was at a group called the Kips Bay Group. And he ended the meeting like this. And I made myself memorize it. And when I say it, you'll see how different it is. He said, please remember that anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. Please, what you heard here, please take it with you. Who you saw here, please leave that knowledge behind. Help us maintain this spiritual legacy. I'll say it again. Principles before personalities. Please, what you heard here, take it with you. Who you saw here, please leave that knowledge behind. Help us maintain this spiritual legacy. Now that sounds cool, doesn't it? That sounds like reality. We're enabled to take what we heard and go use it in our lives. But we're not allowed to tell who was here. Now, Dovetail that with what you hear today. Who you saw here, what you heard here, leave it here. When you say it, it's something that sounds limerickal, but how detrimental is it? Because we don't realize sometimes subconsciously when we say things, we listen to it. They're telling us, don't use anything you heard here in your life. And I say BS to that. And the people that wrote the book said BS to that because they implored me to take what I heard and use it. But who I saw, leave that knowledge behind. So there's also something that I always end, and the 12 hooks to the 12 in the steps, because time is out. I have no more time. I have to end this talk. So I always end the talk with a certain phrase. I call it a hook. I highly recommend everybody have their own hook. I've had mine. It's not my hook. I just happen to say it. But interestingly enough, in the step, you see, it says, having had something, I have to say something. Having had something, I have to say something. Because I have to say it out loud. It can't be implied. So what am I supposed to say? After this talk, let me recap. We hadn't talked about any war stories. We talked about valuable information about the tradition, about how they connect to each other, about how they flow with our primary purpose, our unity of purpose. We talked about the various issues that were the underpinnings that brought about these and how they build on each other. We talked about some interesting stories behind, and I went off into maybe a couple of stories about some stuff out of the big book and some players. But what we haven't done is talk about war stories at all. So that being said, and with time being out, I've had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, and I'll pass.